we're about ready to get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the first in a series of webinars on language access in research. Today's webinar focuses on the approach that we used for New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey from a framework of equity, inclusion, and data quality. Before we note, please note that before we start, please note that this panel will be conducted in English, but if you would like to turn on closed captioning in your preferred language, please click on the closed captioning button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select your preferred language. There is also a link in the chat if you need support for this. And a recording of this webinar will be also made available later. But just up front, we want you all to know that the public Q&A portion of this webinar that's at the end of the session will not be recorded, but this beginning part will. So finally, before we start, I just want to say that we're currently in the field for the 2023 NYCHVS. We encourage any New Yorkers are invited to participate, say yes, participation is safe, it's important, and it's confidential. Our panel today includes contributors to language access efforts on the NYCHVS. So thank you to everyone involved in rethinking the NYCHVS through the lens of language justice and making this happen today. I'm Sonia Rao. I am a researcher at the American Bar Foundation in Chicago, where I'm currently writing a book about interpreters' working conditions in immigration court, and I'm researching and writing about how law students, lawyers, and judges are trained to work across languages. I'll be moderating today's webinar, and I'd like to turn it over now to introduce our panelists, or have them introduce themselves. We'll go Janet, then Deepsika, Allison, Jonathan, and Caitlin. Janet, would you like to start?
Yes, hi, I'm Janet, a graphic designer. We should do it all. For my role in this project that we'll be looking at, I was part of the identity development and worked on all the pieces of this package, including such as like the flashcards, booklets, and sort of really worked hands-on through the layouts and details of the typography of the different languages.
Hi, everyone. I'm Deepsika Chatterjee. I'm a practitioner and professor of design, theater, and cultural studies at Hunter College in New York City. I have a PhD from CUNY Graduate Center, and I grew up in a multilingual society in India. On this project, I was a Bengali translator. So,
Allison?
Hi, my name is Allison Corbett. I use she, her pronouns, and I served as the language access manager for the NYCHVS in 2021, and I am a language justice worker and oral historian.
Hi, everybody. Jonathan Jackson, he, him pronouns, creative director, designer at We Should Do It All. Work in tandem with Janet on this project, helping all things visual. So yeah, happy to be here tonight. Thank you.
And hi, I'm Caitlin Wakeman, Deputy Director at the Center for Research on Home. I was involved throughout the redesign for the NYCHVS, which we'll be telling you more about, including managing the advanced translation process that we utilized.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia Bassi. I support communications and strategy at the Center for Research on Home, and I'll be on hand to help with the back end and any logistics. Back to you, Sonia.
Great. Excited to get started. To everyone in our audience, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A as we go. We have huge turnout tonight, so we're going to have to do our best to get everyone's Q&A, but we're being wary of time. So I'm going to turn it straight over to Caitlin and Allison to start our presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Sonia. I'm going to share my screen now, and if someone can just confirm that this is working. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So yes, thank you everyone for joining. We really appreciate this chance to be able to share the work that we've done on the New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey. This is about particularly the language justice informed approach that we took to these efforts. And Allison and I will take some time to walk you through step by step. So first, we'll tell you a little bit more about the New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey and what it is. We'll tell you what language justice is and why it is a priority for these efforts. We'll talk about the context that we have here in New York City and what makes it so important. We'll tell you a little bit more about our translation process, and then we'll tell you about our more holistic approach that we took to considering language access in every aspect of the survey. So first, I'd like to tell you about the New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, or the NYCHVS, as I will sometimes refer to it. This is a citywide representative survey of New York City's housing stock and population. It's fielded about every 3 years, and it is conducted by the US Census Bureau on behalf of the city of New York. So we here at the city are the sponsors of the NYCHVS. The survey is a really important resource for New York City and is the source of New York City's official vacancy rate. It's also part of the requirement to extend local and state rent regulation in New York City, which covers about 1/3 of New York City's housing stock. These data are used by researchers, policymakers, and advocates in a variety of different areas, including housing, of course. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we conduct the NYCHVS. So the survey is based on a sample of housing units. So rather than selecting people, we are selecting apartments or houses and then speaking with the people who live there. That sample is made up of about 12,000 housing units. And we speak with someone who is living there and is knowledgeable about the unit. This is done via an in-person interview, either with the person who's living there, or if the unit is vacant, with someone who is knowledgeable about the unit. These interviews are done by a US Census field representative, and they take about 30 minutes if it's an occupied unit, or about 10 minutes if it's vacant. The way that they do this is they have a laptop with the questionnaire, and the field representative asks the questions out loud. The interview covers a lot of ground and includes questions about the building, the unit itself, questions about the respondent, and questions about the people that they live with. So the survey has been asked consistently for a long time and has a really important history in New York City. It's been conducted since 1965 and is the longest running housing survey in the US. However, until 2017, the NYCHVS was only formally conducted in English. And in 2017, the survey was translated into Spanish as well. But for 2021, we really wanted to take a critical eye to the NYCHVS and worked collaboratively with the US Census Bureau to implement a full redesign, really thinking about the survey from A to Z and thinking about every aspect of the survey. For this redesign, it was important to us that we honor the legacy and maintain the quality of the history of the NYCHVS, but that we also bring it up to the modern New York City and make it relevant, and also make it accessible to all New Yorkers. So for this redesign, we prioritized equity and inclusion for all New Yorkers, as well as, because this is a survey, ensuring high data quality as well. These really go hand in hand though, because by making sure that we include all New Yorkers being able to participate, we also make sure that the data for the NYCHVS represent the diversity of all of New York City's residents.
So to give additional context to the 2021 redesign of the New York City HVS, it's helpful to just start by looking at the demographic realities of our extremely multilingual city. So according to 2021 one-year ACS, American Community Survey estimates, nearly 3.1 million New Yorkers were born outside of the US. About a quarter of New Yorkers, 24%, have limited English proficiency. This is an official designation used within this survey to produce the data, the ACS. And so we won't be using that term, often abbreviated as LEP, throughout the presentation, but we will use it to refer to official statistics and designations that are relevant. And then finally, over half of New Yorkers, 55%, speak a language other than English at home. Next. And so something that's helpful to just put into context these 1.7 million New Yorkers with limited English proficiency is to take a look at the breakdown of the top 3 language groups within the city and compare those numbers to the populations of other cities. So if we took just Spanish-speaking New Yorkers, not bilingual Spanish speakers, but Spanish speakers with limited English proficiency, that could be about equivalent to the population of San Francisco. If we take both Mandarin and Cantonese and other Chinese language speakers who have limited English proficiency, they could form a city of their own about as large as Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And finally, Russian speakers with limited English proficiency total up to a population about the size of Provo, Utah. So as you can see, just by sheer numbers, if we are only conducting interviews for the survey in English, we're going to miss key data about the city's residents, right? And so as our colleague, Ken Lowe, who's here tonight and is the Senior Advisor for Language Access at the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs in the city, as Ken often says, a multilingual city requires a multilingual government. And so hence a multilingual city also requires and deserves a multilingual survey. And the purpose of the HVS is really to capture the full diversity and vibrance of New Yorkers. And that's only going to be possible with a dedicated commitment to conducting interviews in the languages that are most commonly spoken in the city. And so to pursue this goal of equity and access, the sponsor team drew on the framework of language justice to guide us in our efforts. Language justice is an ever-evolving framework and set of practices that ensure that people can lead, speak, and participate fully in their communities, regardless of the languages or linguistic variants that they use. Language justice pairs tools like interpretation and translation with an analysis of how power operates through language to create multilingual spaces and decenter English. And so while many of you can attest, people have been finding creative ways of bridging language difference for about as long as humans could communicate. But the specific practices and framework of language justice that we drew on and that I personally am formed in the lineage of emerged out of community organizing movements in the US South. And today, across the US and beyond, language workers, organizers, and communities, some of whom are here with us tonight, continue to expand and innovate on what language justice means and how it looks in different contexts. So language justice is never sort of a final fixed destination. It's never quite a linear progression. And we found it really useful to define for ourselves what it would look like to put into practice different language attitudes in the context of the New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey. So you can see on the screen, there's a continuum of language justice, starting with language exclusion on the far side, culminating in language justice. And so language exclusion in the context of the survey could look like only offering the survey in English, not making any efforts to hire bilingual staff or include non-dominant language speakers in data collection. language tolerance, where there's some accommodations made, but really no dedicated support for the implementation or equitable practice of this, could look like having printed translations mailed upon request and having the survey translated ad hoc by untrained bilingual field representatives. And in the framework of language access, which many of you are probably also familiar with, which we sort of tie to the legislative obligations that institutions in the US have to provide services for non-dominant language speakers without necessarily touching that dynamic of power and English dominance that is in play throughout the US. And so that could look like having interpreters and formal translations available upon request, but still treating English as the default language of the survey and of its respondents. And with a language justice approach, what we did was decenter English in the instrument, the survey instrument, and all the materials that were provided to everyone involved, and make sure that respondents who speak languages other than English are directly connected with field representatives who speak their preferred language. So language justice is really trying to combat a hierarchy that puts English at the top and asks us to really engage with a deeper transformation and rethinking and redesign of our systems, and hence our survey with multilingualism in mind.
Right, so keeping that advanced translation goal in mind, these were the priorities that we had in place when we thought about our translation process. So for this translation, we dedicated ourselves to pursue an advanced translation approach. This is the gold standard for translation in surveys and otherwise, and we learned a lot about it from our colleagues at the US Census Bureau, and really dedicated ourselves to this process because it was important to us that we had this goal of language justice in mind as we pursued this redesign for the NYCHVS. So for this translation, we pursued an NYCHVS questionnaire in Spanish, Russian, Bengali, Haitian Creole, traditional Chinese, and simplified Chinese. So this method of advanced translation has been used since 2010 by the European Social Survey. And that's the basis and the basic structure that we used as guidelines when we underwent our own advanced translation process. So for the advanced translation approach, we rely on collaboration between translators and researchers to give feedback to each other about how to better the instrument and identify any potential barriers. For our translation approach, we specifically used local translators because we knew, and anyone who's New York City based here knows as well, is that there are many New York City specific terms in English, but also in all of the other languages spoken here in New York City as well. And so this collaboration allows everyone to work together to identify barriers. And these barriers could come in many different forms. So some might be terms or phrases or concepts that just don't translate directly into another language. For any language workers here, you may regularly have to work around something or find an alternate phrase or a set of sentences that may work, but we wanted to avoid that when possible. We also wanted to be aware of any terms or phrases that are not commonly used and make sure that we were avoiding using those in a survey that would be administered to the entire diversity of all New York. We also wanted to be aware of culturally specific questions, so not only language specific, but also culturally, that might be isolating or difficult to understand if someone is not coming from a New York City context. Another thing we had to be aware of was the length of questions that we were writing and the grammatical structure of questions as well. This is something that came up a lot and was oftentimes a barrier to providing a translation or coming to an equivalent translation. So we had to rethink the length of questions and structure of questions oftentimes. And then lastly, we came up against hyperspecificity in answer options. So oftentimes in surveys, we'll use something called Likert scales. You'd probably recognize these if you saw them, something like strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. And while that spacing makes sense and is intuitive in English, finding the exact same spacing in a translation that is the exact same is very difficult and a barrier that we wanted to think critically about. So the way that we addressed these was through multiple rounds of consensus meetings. These are meetings with researchers and translators, both within and across languages. These meetings led to significant changes in the questionnaire, and we had multiple rounds of meetings and multiple iterations of the questionnaire. What this meant is that all of the questionnaires in all of the languages were being developed simultaneously as we addressed barriers together. And all of the questionnaires were finalized at the same time as well, including English. So we learned so much from this process, and it has influenced the way that we think about our language approach in general. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it here today, but we are going to have another webinar focusing entirely on this topic. So I look forward to being able to talk more about it then. But I'm also excited to have Deepsika here with us today, who's going to be able to provide so much more context and in-depth experience to this during our Q&A. So our advanced translation process taught us so much, but we also knew that translation is only one piece of the process. And it's not sufficient on its own to support all New Yorkers. Throughout the redesign, we were thinking from A to Z for the whole survey, and we wanted to make sure that we took this holistic approach towards language justice for the NYCHVS as well. So we were careful to try and consider language in each component of fieldwork and beyond. We learned a lot during that, which we'll be talking through now, and we know we have more to learn as well. So I told you a little bit about our advanced translation. I'll also be talking about our multilingual materials, both physical and electronic, from the start all the way through the end of the survey. And then we'll also be talking about training of field representatives and how we emphasized the importance of this multilingual approach, while also supporting them in the work that they would be doing. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about these materials, which we worked with We Should Do It All, who are here on the call today, and I'm really excited to be able to get their perspective on this process, to make sure that we were incorporating all of our languages into all of the materials that we were creating from start to finish of the survey. So first, I'll tell you about our informational packet. If you've ever been invited to participate in a survey before, you've probably received some sort of letter telling you about it. Our outreach materials included an invitation letter, a brochure, and a coloring book. All of these materials were produced equally in all 7 of our languages. A common approach is to produce something in English and to offer minor alternate translations that provide a little bit of context. But for us, it was important that we had our messaging equally in all of our languages, since everyone would need to know what the survey is and what participation would entail. So one example is our brochure, which you can see here, includes all of the languages for the title displayed equally. But I'll also show you, and I'm going to stop sharing for a second, what this brochure looks like actually physically. So the brochure is here, and people receive these in the mail, but also field representatives use them in the field as well. So WSDIA did such a wonderful job thinking about how we could make sure that this was equally messaged in each of our languages. So we have the title, and you can open it up and see it in English. However, when you open it further, we have Spanish and Russian, and when you open it even further, you can see that we have all of our languages equally displayed here. And what we really loved about this and the innovations that field representatives used in the field is that you can fold this up and make it a custom brochure in the target language that the person speaks. And so that means when you approach someone at the door, you don't need to go and have them flipping to the inside looking for it. Instead, I can offer custom materials in their preferred language right from the start. So that's something that they did that we were really impressed with and are excited to be able to continue with for the NYCHVS. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen again. So of course we needed to be able to reach people not only with physical materials, but also with electronic materials. So this is our NYCHVS website, which expanded from our 7 languages into 16 languages. So the thing that we love about this website is that it is immediately accessible. Oftentimes when you visit a website, it will be in English, but you can look for a toggle into another language in one of the corners and you can switch it over. But something that WSDIA came up with and that we really love both for its accessibility as well as how beautiful it is that when people visit the NYCHVS website, they just need to click on the word welcome in their preferred language and they will interact with a website that is entirely in their preferred language. So that way, right from the start, this friendly page allows someone to go in and have an immersive informational experience on our website. Another way that we reach out to people and that we love to talk about is our Sorry I Missed You or SIMI cards. These are blank cards that are oftentimes used in surveys by field representatives to leave notes for people if they're not at home. So these other SIMIs oftentimes use pre-printed notes on them. However, we intentionally left these SIMIs blank with an illustration on the back. It looks like this, and they are this big if you can see me. And the reason that we left these blank is that because it means that the note can be written in any language and entirely custom without having to write around a pre-written note. It also means that the note can be written in any direction, which is important for many of the languages that we would be reaching out to people in. And it allows for custom content that is not only personable to the person, but also culturally appropriate. You may be wondering in the field how a field representative identifies the language that someone prefers so that we can route it to someone who speaks that language. We would never ask that a field representative try to identify a language by guessing from what they hear. Instead, all field representatives are equipped with a language card. These are commonly used in surveys, but the reason that we think this one is really special is because it's clear and easy to see. You can see that we have a huge number of languages here displayed in English and then the language in that target language as well. It's organized by color and it's also organized by prevalence of the language spoken in New York City and cultural appropriateness. And so someone can look at this and identify the language that they prefer in their target language and point to it and make sure that it gets routed quickly to them and that they can participate in the language that they speak. This was also important that it was clear and visible from further away because we were in the field for the NYCHVS at a time when there were still really high numbers of hospitalization from COVID-19. So this allowed people to keep a distance while still being able to make these language identifications as well. Of course, we also, this was all before the interview, but we wanted to think about language within the interview as well. So all of our interview packets were produced in each of our 7 languages, including a flashcard, community resource guide, and a thank you letter. Our priority for these interview packets was to provide an immersive language experience. So not only would questions be asked out loud in someone's preferred language, but everything that they interacted with would be in their preferred language as well. So here you can see our flashcards come in their preferred language. So when they're asked out loud, of course, people are able to select the answer option that they prefer. I'll go ahead and show you what this looks like when they hold and they can flip through to see that. And then I'm going to go ahead and share. And then the thank you materials also were designed to be entirely in the preferred language, and not only thank the participant for their participating in the NYCHVS, but also directing them to city resources via phone numbers and websites that could get them help in their preferred language as well. Okay, I'll turn it to Allison for training.
So as you've been hearing, there were a lot of efforts put into the translation of the survey, to creating and designing these wonderful multilingual materials. And like Caitlin mentioned, we knew that the production of materials was not enough. And in order to make sure that that all of these multilingual efforts were really able to be implemented. And again, that our field representatives were supported in implementing this new approach to conducting the survey in multiple languages. We designed a set of trainings that would be part of the overall module of trainings that field representatives took. And so the foundation of this language access series of trainings was a language access, language justice training for all field representatives that they took at the beginning of their training time that was 2 hours long and really set a baseline understanding and built buy-in for an equity-centered approach and a language justice informed approach to implementing a multilingual survey, why it was important, as well as the practicalities of how to actually reroute cases and how to use language identification cards and all of that. And from there, we also designed 2 additional tracks of training for field representatives, one for bilingual field representatives who would be using the translated survey, the translated instrument. And then for the bilingual field representatives who spoke languages outside of the survey's core 7 languages, which covers a vast swath of New Yorkers, but we know there are many, many languages spoken in New York, and we also had many field representatives who spoke some of those languages. So those field representatives were tasked with self-translating the survey. And so we wanted to ensure that they had more support and we're not truly doing on-the-fly translation. So we had, for each of these groups, a lesson to sort of prepare them and give them guidance for having, for conducting an interview in their target language, and then also a practice session. And we'll talk a little bit more about the self-translating practice session in a moment. And then we also made sure that throughout the other training modules that field representatives took, there were language access pieces reinforced throughout, particularly through examples that were given in other training modules. Next. And so the goals that we had with this training approach was really to create a shared understanding that all field representatives play a role in ensuring linguistic equity and inclusion, right? We as sponsors play a role in sort of providing the container, providing the supports. Monolingual English-speaking field representatives are also really key in this process in making sure that, that respondents get connected to field representatives that speak their language. And then, of course, bilingual and multilingual field representatives have their role as well. But it is not just the domain of bilingual and multilingual folks to ensure that there's equity and inclusion for non-dominant language speakers. And we also wanted to address some of the practices that we thought could improve the data quality of the survey. So reduce the use of English proficiency as a key criteria for determining which adult, which person is the best respondent in a household to interview. We wanted to decrease the use of third parties as interpreters and attempts that may be well-meaning but misguided to muddle through interviews with insufficient language skills. And, you know, we were changing protocols and the way a multilingual survey was administered. So we wanted to really also gain buy-in and build support for bilingual field representatives who could use the translated instrument and shift from doing on-the-fly translation when it's not necessary to really using the translated instrument that was produced with so much effort and care and research. And then finally, also provide support so that there could be improved consistency and comparability of the data that's collected by the field representatives in the cases where they do have to do self-translation. So unfortunately, we don't have the time to read all of this through. So for those of you who are able to read what's on the screen, you can see there's an example of a scenario that we used in the language access, language justice training that all field representatives took. And so we explore a scenario in the field with Amaka, who's a field representative who comes across Jean-Georges, a respondent who speaks Haitian Creole. Amaka tries to muddle through, but ends up with an incomplete interview. Jean-Georges is frustrated. And so we talk about what happened. We talk about how Amaka made her decision, what she could have done differently, and what are the consequences of, for example, in this case, having a respondent who was not able to communicate in his language, was frustrated, wasted his time, and how that might affect, even if a field representative who does speak his language goes back and attempts again, that rapport has been damaged and may even affect his willingness to participate in city surveys or other efforts in the future. And we have another excerpt from the bilingual self-translation practice session. And so these practice sessions, we really modeled after the advanced translation consensus meetings. So we had a mixed group of field representatives who spoke many different languages. We took excerpts, particularly tricky to translate excerpts of the survey, and provided field representatives with time to workshop translations. So the one that we have on the screen is about shares in co-ops, talks about condos and being a successor to someone else's lease. These are all things that we know to be a little bit technical, specific to New York, and that may not have equivalents in other target languages. So after field representatives took time to attempt a translation of this, they shared strategies, talked about what was difficult and how they worked with this terminology. We were also then able to provide support by sharing definitions, right? So part of being able to accurately self-translate means that it's really important that the field representative also understands really well for themselves what all of these things are. And so that was a way that we, as the sponsors, could support them in then translating the definition if there wasn't a direct translation of the word itself. And so as you can see across these different approaches to advanced translation, translated materials, and robust training for field representatives, it was the trickle-down effect, right? So the advanced translation really impacted the work, impacted how the materials were designed, which therefore was also in conversation with how we implemented the training. And translation, of course, maybe be the most visible and tangible step in creating a multilingual survey, but we also know that having a well-translated instrument has to be bolstered by support throughout the entire process of carrying out a survey. And while we did implement a lot of language justice practices into our approach of the multilingual redesign of the survey, we also know that there's more to be done and more that we can do to fully embody and practice language justice in the survey. In particular, the dissemination of research and findings and accessibility for users of the data that we produce from the survey is really important and something that we don't see often enough in language access conversations, and something that we will also be exploring in the final webinar of the series that we also hope you can join us for.
Great.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Sonia.
Thank you so much, Allison, for that presentation. And we're going to switch now to the moderated Q&A with several team members of the project that you just saw some of. And to just sort of in that little conclusive spirit, I just wanted to ask Caitlin also if you wanted to have some conclusive thoughts on, what really motivated this kind of broad group of people to come together and invest time and resources into this big project for a complete redesign of this survey. And then we can get started with our questions.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be quick, but I think that learning about the advanced translation process from our colleagues at the Census Bureau and colleagues at APOR inspired us to want to use advanced translation to make sure that we're being responsible in our approach to translation here. But the more that we went through the advanced translation and learned from people like Deepshika, who's here, and we realized how much we could learn from it, but also how big this world is and how much more we had to do and wanted to do, and how language was really involved and integral to each aspect of the survey. And as we started to pull language into each aspect of the survey, for example, working with WSDAA on materials, but learning more about language justice from Allison and learning from other colleagues at Moya, our world really opened up and became a huge priority for us. So we not only did this become a huge priority for us in the survey, but also advocating for this work and research in general, I think is a priority for us, a lot of us on the team now.
That's great. And I think that's really what brings us here today. So if I can, I think I will move to our design team at WSDAA, since it's really unusual for many of us to be able to get to hear your perspectives. So first, I wanted to ask if you have ever worked on multilingual projects before this, and then given that on this project, what principles did you sort of bring from previous experiences, and what was new for you working on this project? Jonathan, maybe you want to start?
Yeah, thanks. Again, thanks for having me here tonight. This is fun, and to rehash, this incredible process. So, but to answer your question, Sonia, we had some projects here and there that translated to English and Spanish or English and French, but never to the robust scope to which HVS was looking for in this. So that was quite new to me. Maybe Janet has a different answer in her work history, but nothing for me this robust before. And then sort of the principles that we relied on to get through it, I think was really important, is what Caitlin said just before we started. This was really to understand the world to which HVS lives, the field researchers, and understanding the language justice personnel too, where all these responsibilities are coming from. We had no real foundation, so we had to get to know things quite quickly, and that was fun, and we were super inquisitive and curious in that process, and I think that approaching it with an open mind really helped. Janet, I don't know if you want to add on anything here, but
yeah, I think with my background, I personally speak Mandarin, Cantonese, and English, and some of the previous work I've done involves working with Chinese, both traditional and simplified, and obviously English. And even through that process of working with two different written forms, I really learned that, it's really about everything's in the details to see if you understand this language. Say, if the punctuation is placed at a higher point in the line, it's different between simplified Chinese and traditional Chinese. So it's almost like you can tell if something was Google translated. You can also tell if somebody just plopped in one language and said it in the language that it corresponds to. But if all their spacing and whatever is off, you can tell there was really, there's no understanding of it. So through design with good translation, you can tell that there was care put into the process. Yeah, and actually, I guess adding on to sort of what's new about this, being a part of this process was just hearing, actually participating and listening to the translators process itself was super eye-opening, and being challenged to build the system that is trying to make it bulletproof as it expands from 7 to like 16 languages.
Yeah. Speaking of the consultation process, that sort of brings in our translator, Deepshika. Do you have any reflections on how you experienced this consultation process, this back and forth? What were some of the kind of unique challenges of it or benefits of it?
Yeah, so I joined the team in 2019 as a Bengali translator. And I translate like poems or plays, like things I do in the arts and cultural field. But requiring translation, doing this translation for a survey required a precision, immense precision. And there was no, at least initially, I felt like there was no room for like, cultural consulting, because I had to be so precise, right? Like Janet was saying, where the question mark goes, where the punctuation mark goes, all of these details. But then it soon became clear that we were working with something that was kind of mechanical, and we had to sort of make it work for the New York population, right? The people who were going to get it. And initially, when I looked at the survey, I was like, whoa, this is like so many pages of questions. And it almost felt like, there was an auntie in the room who's like asking so many questions to this young kid in the, at dinner table, like Thanksgiving table or something like that. But ultimately, that is actually valuable, because that is, those prying questions is where you get the actual information, right? Like I was telling Caitlin that, initially I was like, why are they asking? Like, is there a hole in the wall, or is paint chipped off the wall? But actually, when we think of it, that is where the details are. That is where the quality of the housing is. And that's where we're going to get the real information, right? But there were, that's like very New York specific, right? But there's like very culture specific details that we had to attend to. For example, very quickly we realized like there were questions around finances that would be impossible to answer in the languages, like the word loan or mortgage. These are two different things that are being asked. But then if we translate, it's just Reen. In Bengali, it's Reen. But it doesn't like, do you have an auto loan? Do you have a car loan? Do you have a student loan? Do you have a housing loan? There's like so many little types of loans that can happen. So then we decided that it's better to, in consultation with Caitlin, that it is better to just keep the financial terms that people might have used in banks or other financial institutions as English terms, because trying to translate that was going to cause more problems and more harm than good. So that was one of the examples for sure. We tried to, like, for example, we're living in like AI generated world right now, right? So there's like, what a machine can translate and what with cultural details can be translated. So one example was the lift and the elevator, right? So if you translate the word elevator through like machine learning systems, it'll, in Bengali, it'll make it lift. There isn't any Bengali word for lift. So you would have to do it as lift, but lift is a British term. The reason lift is used is because where Bengali is spoken in India and in Bangladesh were British colonies, right? So the term lift is used, but that wouldn't make sense here. So we decided to change that and just use elevator, but in Bengali font. So at every step, we had to do those kinds of adjustments in order to make the content more approachable and New York specific. So I started with a lot of precision, but as the project went along, I started to create a column in our Excel sheets and like note that this is not possible. This is like this, the intent of this question is changing as we are translating. And then we would like go back to Caitlin and we would have consultations on how to like rework things. So that was my experience.
Yeah. It seems like the issues with formatting, fonts, all of this might be where your challenges and the design team's challenges might have intersected, and you would have had to consult maybe over and over. Is that something that you had experienced before, or is this something you were learning through? Maybe Janet or Jonathan has an answer for that.
Janet, you want to go?
Definitely first time in this one, like working with a lot more languages that I don't know of. And I do recall, like when I was studying Bengali, there would be like parts where the software itself doesn't identify like what letter it is, and I would have to like try to find it in there and then send it over for everyone to review if I found the right one. But yeah, I think there's definitely like that back and forth process is very important. And I guess also in terms of design, some other challenges we had, such as the pamphlet you saw earlier, that was sort of like that gauge full and it opens up. Really, because when you translate, say one English sentence, it would be really short in Chinese, but it could get really long in Russian. So it's really about like testing what we have set up and being like, is it going to work against everything? And is it going to feel like it's taking the same amount of space and importance when it is all put together?
Yeah, I think it's constant battle of finding lowest common denominators and those type of frameworks to make the overall brand cohesive, no matter the language that's involved. And I think one thing that was present as Caitlin and Allison were going through the presentation, it was as page by page goes by and seeing translation of the logo, it does feel cohesive. I think the graphic elements of color, the rounded corners, like there's little things besides language that also play a key factor in bringing everything together. So yeah.
Great. So now that you've had this experience, what do you think you would sort of plan for in advance? What do you think other institutions should know about doing these kind of multilingual projects where they can kind of prepare to work with a team like yours that would, say, be ready to do this?
Yeah, for a group like us who we're a small studio of 8 people, but I think 6 of those 8 people speak multiple languages. I'm sadly one of the people who don't. But I do think it's important to, when it comes for institutions, to think about who they've hired and making sure that they have the support to take on a true investment in language. And, as we noted, language is power. So in this idea of inclusion, we don't want to exclude anyone. So I think hiring practices and frankly, institutions recognizing that they don't know everything and should be willing to bring on more partners to make this a successful endeavor, I think is really important.
That makes sense. Deepshika, as a translator, as a member of the diverse team, what was new to you about working on this project? What was different about it as a translator that you maybe hadn't experienced before and would like to see more of in the projects that you work on?
Yeah, my cousin grew up in New York in the 90s, and I had immigrated to the US in the early 2000s. And her experience growing up in public schools in New York was so different. There was no inclusion of language. There was, exclusion, as Allison was explaining, right? Like there was like language tolerance even was like such a thing back then. So what happened is, by the time the second generation and the third generation go along, they lose the language, right? And part of our, those of us who grew up in other places and speak other languages is to like try to hold on to some of that, right? And I try to like teach my kids all of this. And the part that I think is crucial over here is like, just as a user, like seeing Bengali is so valuable. Like I mean, I'm a professor. Mostly I don't get to use Bengali in my classes, right? But I do have students. My CUNY students are a diverse group of students from New York, and their lives are just as rich. So we are trying to reach that community of students, right? That community of people who live in the city. I don't live in the city. I live in New Jersey. But the point is, in order to reach our community, we have to reach them at the level where we can make that connection, right? So, whether it's those auntie prying questions or what, all of those questions will tell us more about their lives and more about their stories. So it's important to have that connection. So, but I think in terms of translation, there were some interesting findings. Like we kept telling Caitlin, like, the questions are so long, like, can we just make them simpler? But the problem was because we were doing it over 7 languages. And thankfully, we didn't just do it in COVID times. We had started before COVID. So I had met some of the other translators, and the issues I had faced, I know that the other translators were facing, like Haitian Creole was facing the same, Russian was facing the same. So we had some discussions about the difficulties around this. But the more complex the sentences, the harder it is to translate. The more phrases there are, the more difficult it becomes. And by the time you start from the English's like first phrase to the end of the 6th phrase of English, and you start to translate that, you're in a totally different question in Bengali or any other language. So I think that's like constantly something that we had to work on. And the more, the more attention we pay to that, I think is important.
Yeah. So just kind of wrapping up our moderated Q&A session, let's think a little bit about the future. What projects are you working on now? What projects are you hoping to work on in the future, where you are applying lessons learned maybe from this project and bringing this learning to other communities? Anyone can kind of take this question, but I have a feeling all of you might have an answer, but.
I mean, I'll say that we're working on a couple of exhibitions, and I think regardless of the actual content in those exhibitions are of course extremely important, but the idea of accessibility and who gains knowledge to the stories that we're trying to tell is really important, and how language plays out in that is something that we are in constant learning of, and this was a huge stepping stone for us to participate in and set the tone for projects as we move forward.
I can go next. So we've of course been thinking a lot about this, and I think one of the first steps that we're taking is that we're excited to be able to continue these conversations and learning from others who are thinking about this a lot, and also sharing what we've learned so far. So we're really excited about these webinars and being able to talk about translation. And then Allison alluded to this as well. I think that we oftentimes think about how we collect information in different languages, but I think making sure that we share information back out to the public and to people who speak languages other than English is just as important and is much newer to us. So something that we are hoping to be incorporating and planning to be incorporating more into our work, but that's a new endeavor for us that we're excited to be able to talk with others about as well.
Yeah, and we'll be hearing about in the third part of the webinar, which is exciting.